Hidden stories from Auschwitz the world was never meant to see. The cold wind bit into their skin like knives, but no one dared to shiver. A single breath out of rhythm could attract the wrong kind of attention, and in Auschwitz, the wrong kind of attention could mean death. The food, if you could call it that, arrived in heavy wooden barrels. Inside was a thick, almost unrecognizable soup, mostly water with scraps of vegetables floating like ghosts of real meals. Each prisoner received about a single liter, ladled into a brown plate they guarded like treasure. That plate, along with a spoon, hung from their belt, the only tools between them and starvation. Lose it, and you didn't just lose a meal. You lost your chance to survive. At the end of each grueling day, prisoners didn't simply walk back to their barracks. They carried the dead bodies of those who had collapsed, been beaten, or simply given up on life to be burned. Dinner was barely better than lunch, bread so stale it could break teeth, sometimes a sliver of meat or cheese, more often nothing at all. By mid-1942, the German command realized tens of thousands were dying too quickly. But make no mistake, this wasn't an act of mercy. It was a calculation. Dead prisoners couldn't work, and without labor, the Nazi war machine slowed. For Jews and Soviet captives, however, there would be no reprieve. They had been marked for total extermination from the start, condemned to starvation, disease, and the gas chambers until the very last breath. Today, we will reveal never-before-seen color images that capture the brutal, unflinching reality of life in Auschwitz, not just statistics, but moments frozen in time, each one a silent witness to humanity's darkest hours. On the 1st of September, 1939, the world trembled as German forces stormed into Poland. 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, tearing the country in two under the grim terms of the German-Soviet Pact signed just weeks earlier in August. In the center of the conquered land, the Germans carved out the so-called general government, a territory ruled entirely by Nazi administration, enforced by a brutal network of police and SS units. The East fell under Soviet control at least until June 1941, when Hitler betrayed his temporary ally and German forces swept into Soviet-held Poland, extending Nazi rule deeper than ever. By autumn of that year, almost the entire European continent lay beneath the shadow of the swastika. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, one by one, they had fallen. Now, the German war machine turned its full attention eastward, and with it came a machinery of human cruelty unlike anything the world had ever known. Concentration camps were not new to the Nazis. Since 1933, they had been used to imprison political opponents, criminals, and Jews inside Germany's own borders. But with the conquest of Europe, the Nazis began building these camps in occupied territories as well. Among them, one would soon eclipse all others in infamy: Auschwitz. Founded in mid-1940 on the outskirts of Oswiecim, a small Polish city annexed into the Third Reich, and given the German name Auschwitz, the camp at first served a grimly familiar function. It was intended as another link in the chain of prisons for those deemed enemies of the state. But starting in 1942, it transformed into something even darker: the largest mass extermination center for Jews in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. The SS, initially created to guard Nazi meetings, had by now evolved into a vast, multi-headed beast, part police force, part military, part political enforcer. In Auschwitz, they were both jailers and executioners. At first, the camp's garrison was purely German, but over time, the ranks swelled with Volksdeutsche ethnic Germans from other countries who had sworn loyalty to the Reich. By the time Auschwitz finally fell, around 8,000 SS soldiers had served there, each one a cog in the machinery of terror. By June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union had poured a flood of new captives into the camp. What began as 700 Polish prisoners swelled to over 11,000 within a single year. Poles, Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, communists, and anyone else branded as subhuman. In October of that year, construction began on Auschwitz II, Birkenau, a vast new complex built by prisoners themselves. Forced to labor in the brutal Polish winter, many slept in unfinished barracks without roofs, exposed to snow and wind. The weak collapsed under exhaustion, cold, and starvation, and those who could no longer work were beaten or shot where they lay. Birkenau's barracks were only part of its true purpose. Rising beside them were 4 gas chambers, silent and efficient, waiting for the day the final solution would begin in earnest. The expansion of Auschwitz and the machinery of death. From 1940 to 1941, the Nazis began reshaping the land around Auschwitz with cold precision. Residents of the district of Auschwitz and 8 nearby villages were forcibly expelled. For the Jewish community, which had made up about 60% of Auschwitz's population before the war, the fate was swift and merciless. They were herded into ghettos. Many Poles, meanwhile, were deported to Germany for forced labor. The physical landscape changed almost overnight. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed to clear space for the camp's growing infrastructure. The Germans built workshops, warehouses, offices, and living quarters for SS troops. Some of the vacated houses were gifted to SS officers and their families, while others were allocated to German settlers and police officials brought in to tighten control. Existing factories were seized, some dismantled, others rebuilt to fuel the war industry. The crown jewel of this industrial exploitation was the massive IG Farben chemical plant, a key supplier for the Third Reich's synthetic rubber and gasoline. To feed its hunger for labor, the Nazis brought in some 11,000 forced workers, Poles, Russians, French, who toiled under appalling conditions. Auschwitz's central location in occupied Europe, combined with its rail connections, made it the perfect hub for mass deportations from across the continent. At its peak, Auschwitz became a sprawling complex of 3 main camps. Auschwitz I, the original camp, created in mid-1940, expanded steadily to hold between 12,000 and 20,000 prisoners. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, begun in late 1941, located 3 kilometers from the original camp. It would become the largest extermination center in occupied Europe, with gas chambers capable of killing thousands daily. By 1944, it held over 90,000 prisoners. Auschwitz III, Monowitz, established in 1942 near the IG Farben plant, housing more than 11,000 prisoners by 1944, its sole purpose to fuel Nazi industry through slave labor. By early 1942, the Nazis were finalizing what they called the final solution, the plan to annihilate the Jewish people. Auschwitz's size and rail access made it a prime location for industrial-scale killing. The gas chambers in Birkenau were activated, transforming the camp into one of the deadliest sites in all of occupied Europe. The selection process upon arrival was swift and chilling. Prisoners stepped off the trains into a gauntlet of SS guards. Those deemed strong enough were shaved, tattooed with identification numbers, and sent to the overcrowded barracks. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and children were separated almost immediately and marched to the gas chambers under the false pretense of disinfection. Within minutes, they were dead, and the ever-present smoke from the crematoria told the rest of the camp exactly where they had gone. The barracks themselves were an extension of the killing machine. Designed for 700 people but often packed with twice that number, they reeked of filth and disease. Straw mattresses swarmed with fleas, and in some cases there was no bedding at all, only the frozen ground. The small coal stoves offered no real warmth against the bitter Polish winters. Many perished silently in their sleep, claimed by the cold before the sun rose. Daily life and survival in Auschwitz. Before dawn, long before the first light touched the camp's barbed wire, prisoners were jolted awake by SS guards barking orders. At 5 a.m., they were expected to be standing in formation for breakfast, if the word breakfast could even apply. It was usually a foul, bitter herbal infusion or boiled water with a few floating grains. Nobody knew exactly what it was made of, and it tasted so unpleasant that many prisoners struggled to swallow it, yet refusing meant going hungry in a place where hunger was a constant shadow. On rare mornings, a small piece of bread might appear, but it was never enough to dull the gnawing ache in their stomachs. Immediately after, the roll call began. Prisoners were lined up in rigid rows, and every single head had to be counted. If the numbers didn't match, whether due to escape, death, or simple error, the process could drag on for hours. Rain, snow, icy wind, it didn't matter. The guards seemed to take pleasure in prolonging the agony. Some prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or illness right there on the frozen ground, their bodies left to lie until the count was complete. Only when the SS were satisfied did the forced marches begin. Prisoners were sent to various labor detachments, building barracks, working in coal mines, manufacturing war supplies like vehicle parts and weapons, or toiling for private companies such as Bayer and IG Farben, which paid the Nazi state for the privilege of exploiting slave labor. For those working outside, the winter was merciless. with temperatures plunging below freezing. For those inside the factories, the air was thick with dust, fumes, and chemicals, eating away at their lungs. The women assigned to sort through confiscated belongings faced a different kind of torment, sifting through clothes, jewelry, and keepsakes taken from the murdered. Many of these valuables were meant to fund the Nazi war effort, but guards often stole them to send as gifts to their families. Workdays could last 11 hours or more, and mistakes were punished with savage beatings, removal of food rations, or immediate execution. The midday meal was usually a watery soup with potatoes, grains, and flour almost identical to breakfast. Many prisoners vomited it back up, leaving them even weaker for the rest of the day. Hunger was an unrelenting enemy, killing nearly as many as the gas chambers themselves. And yet, even in these conditions, a flicker of human spirit remained. Prisoners whispered stories, shared crusts of bread, and risked punishment to help one another survive. This quiet resistance, the refusal to let the Nazis strip them entirely of their humanity, was as dangerous as it was heroic. The resistance and acts of defiance in Auschwitz, in a place designed to crush the human spirit, resistance might seem impossible. Yet within Auschwitz's barbed wire, courage found a way to breathe. Even under the unrelenting weight of hunger, disease, and terror, prisoners forged small and large acts of defiance, proof that dignity could survive where life itself was under siege. The earliest resistance movements began in the second half of 1940, spearheaded mainly by Polish political prisoners, the largest group in the camp at the time. At first, their struggle was about survival, sharing food, smuggling medicine, and quietly sabotaging work to slow the Nazi machine. But as time passed, their aims grew bolder. By 1942 and 1943, prisoners of other nationalities had joined the fight. Some took enormous risks to maintain secret contact with resistance networks outside the camp. Through these channels, messages describing the horrors of Auschwitz were smuggled out, scraps of truth carried by brave souls who knew that being caught meant certain death. Perhaps the most dramatic act came on the 7th of October, 1944. Members of the Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to operate, the crematoria rose up in armed rebellion. They had lived daily in the shadow of death, watching thousands pass through the gas chambers. That day, they struck back, killing SS guards and setting fire to one of the crematoria. Their victory was brief, their fate sealed. Most were killed during or after the uprising, but their defiance echoed far beyond the camp walls. The resistance wasn't only about weapons or explosions. It lived in the Polish civilians who risked their lives to smuggle in food, clothing, and medicine. It was in the carefully planned escapes, aided by locals who provided shelter to fugitives. It was in the whispered prayers, the hidden cultural gatherings, the refusal to surrender one's identity despite the Nazi effort to reduce prisoners to numbers on an arm. By the end of 1942, the Nazis' final solution was operating in full force, and Auschwitz-Birkenau had become the primary killing center. Prisoners from other camps were brought here to die, often told they were being sent for disinfection. In reality, they were herded into chambers filled with Zyklon B gas, a pesticide turned into an instrument of mass murder. Within minutes, the cries fell silent, and selected prisoners were ordered to remove the bodies, strip them of valuables, and prepare the room for the next transport. Even as the machinery of death reached its peak, the resistance kept fighting in the only ways they could: by saving a comrade from selection, by recording the truth in hidden notes, by daring to believe that one day the world would know what happened here. Medical experiments and atrocities in Auschwitz. If Auschwitz was a world built for suffering, then Block 10 was its deepest descent into horror. Here, science itself was twisted into a weapon, a place where doctors in white coats committed crimes that stripped away any illusion of humanity. Block 10 was reserved for what the Nazis called medical research, but its real purpose was far more sinister. German doctors, operating under the guise of experimentation, treated prisoners as disposable test subjects. Those considered racially inferior were systematically sterilized in an effort to erase entire bloodlines. Women were exposed to high doses of radiation to damage their reproductive organs, or injected with dangerous chemicals that left them in agony, often killing them outright. Those who survived were usually left unable to bear children, and many were later sent to the gas chambers when they could no longer work. Sterilization was only the beginning. The block became a laboratory for experiments that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with cruelty. Prisoners were infected with diseases, subjected to surgeries without anesthesia, and forced to endure extreme conditions to test the limits of human survival. One name still casts a long, cold shadow over these walls: Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. Obsessed with hereditary traits, he sought out prisoners with dwarfism, genetic conditions, or any physical anomaly. Above all, he hunted for twins, whom he subjected to endless examinations, injections, and dissections in pursuit of warped theories about genetics and racial purity. For those under his gaze, survival was rare. Death was merely the final stage of his experiments. Mengele's work was not an isolated madness but part of a larger pattern. The Nazi leadership saw these prisoners as raw material bodies to be used, studied, and discarded. Many of the doctors involved were educated, trained, and fully aware of the Hippocratic oath they had sworn. And yet, they chose to abandon it, replacing "do no harm" with the cold efficiency of industrialized cruelty. Tens of thousands entered these so-called medical facilities. Only a handful lived to tell the tale, and those who did carried scars, physical and emotional, that could never heal. The final statistics and the collapse of Auschwitz. Numbers can feel cold, almost abstract, yet at Auschwitz, each digit hides a human life, a name, a story that ended too soon. Over its years of operation, at least 1.3 million people were deported to the Auschwitz complex. Of these, around 400,000 were formally registered. Miatim, Efes Jews. 150, Zeropol. Esarim Vishlosh, Efs Roma. 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war. 25,000 from other nationalities. More than half of these registered prisoners died inside the camp, starved, worked to death, executed, or consumed by disease and epidemics. About 200,000 others were transferred to different concentration camps, where many met the same fate. The unregistered, the sick, the elderly, pregnant women, and children were sent directly from the train platform to the gas chambers. From 1942 onward, Auschwitz became the deadliest extermination center in the Nazi Empire. Jews arrived from nearly every corner of occupied Europe: Hungary, 438 nol, Poland, 300, France, 69, Apes, the Netherlands, 60,000, Greece, 55, Efes, and tens of thousands more from other countries, bringing the total to approximately 1 million Jews murdered here. By late 1944, the Nazi war machine was faltering. The Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly into Poland, pushing the Germans into retreat. The SS began destroying evidence of their crimes, demolishing gas chambers and crematoria, burning records, tearing down barracks. But they could not erase the truth. Around 60,000 prisoners remained. When the evacuation order came in January 1945, the SS forced them onto the infamous death marches, herding them through the bitter winter with little food, no proper clothing, and temperatures below zero. Anyone who stumbled or lagged behind was shot. Of those who began the march, at least 15,000 died on the road, their bodies left in the snow. When the Soviet troops reached Auschwitz on the 27th of January, 1945, they found about 7,000 prisoners still alive, skeletal, sick, and broken in body, yet somehow still breathing. Among them were Jews, Poles, Roma, Soviets, and prisoners from almost every country in Europe. The liberation of Auschwitz did not end the suffering for those who survived. Many had lost entire families. Many more would carry invisible wounds for the rest of their lives. But that day marked the end of the camp's reign of terror and the beginning of the world's reckoning with the full scale of the Holocaust. Rare or little-known facts about Auschwitz. When most people think of Auschwitz, they picture the iconic gate, the endless barracks, and the gas chambers. But hidden in the details are stories and truths that many have never heard, fragments of the camp's history that reveal just how complex and calculated the Nazi system was. One such detail is the Interessengebiet, or zone of interest, that surrounded the main camp. This wasn't just the immediate area behind the fences and watchtowers. It extended over 40 square kilometers, the size of about 5,600 football fields, and was under strict German control. Any prisoner who stepped beyond the inner perimeter without permission was immediately shot. The zone served as an additional buffer, isolating Auschwitz from the outside world and making escapes even more impossible. Another fact often overlooked is the network of 47 subcamps tied to Auschwitz between 1942 and 944. These satellite camps weren't minor outposts, they were part of a massive economic engine. Prisoners were sent to German-owned mines, power plants, and industrial sites across Upper Silesia, as well as farms and livestock facilities. Their forced labor directly fueled the Nazi war effort, enriching companies like IG Farben and Bayer, which paid the SS for access to this human workforce. Auschwitz also had a calculated system for looting the dead. When transports arrived, belongings were seized immediately: clothes, shoes, photographs, jewelry, even the gold from victims' teeth. Officially, these valuables were meant to support the Reich's finances. In practice, SS officers and guards often kept the best items for themselves, sending stolen watches, rings, and fur coats home to their families as if they were trophies. And then there is the disturbing role of the Sonderkommando. These were not willing collaborators, but prisoners, often Jews themselves, forced under threat of death to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. They moved the bodies, removed valuables, and cleaned the chambers for the next group. Their survival was temporary. Every few months, the SS executed them to eliminate witnesses, yet some risked everything to record what they saw, burying notes in the ground or smuggling them out so that the truth would not die with them. Even the liberation of Auschwitz holds a lesser-known detail. When the Soviets arrived on the 27th of January, 1945, they found not only human survivors, but also mountains of abandoned belongings: over 7,000 kilograms of human hair, hundreds of thousands of garments, and piles of children's shoes. These silent artifacts became some of the most haunting evidence of the crimes committed here. Auschwitz is not just a place on a map, it is a wound on human history. Behind its barbed wire and brick chimneys, over 1 million souls were extinguished, not by chance or in the chaos of battle, but through a calculated, systematic program of annihilation. It was a world where survival hinged on keeping your plate and spoon, where smoke from the crematoria became part of the horizon, and where even the act of sharing a crust of bread could be an act of defiance. When Soviet troops liberated the camp on the 27th of January, 1945, the war was not yet over, but Auschwitz was finally silent. The dead could not be brought back, yet the world would now be forced to see what had happened here. The piles of hair, shoes, and tiny coats spoke louder than any speech could proof, of lives cut short, of families torn apart, of a cruelty so vast that it defied comprehension. Today, those images and stories remain, not to dwell in despair, but to remind us. They demand that we never allow such hatred, such dehumanization, to take root again. Every number in the records was once a living, breathing person, someone with a voice, a dream, a future. May we honor them not just with remembrance, but with vigilance. History has shown us how quickly ordinary people can become perpetrators, bystanders, or victims. It is up to us to ensure the next chapters we write as humanity are not repeats of its darkest pages. Thank you for being part of this journey through one of the most painful yet essential stories of our past. May their memory be a blessing and a warning.